It's a great book. I think it's a fantastic book.
Oh, you've highlighted it. That's my favorite kind of book. Wow, that is seriously
Yeah,
annotated.
I almost felt like I should just highlight the bits I didn't agree with. It might have been quicker with the tabs. And then I've
That's
got different
amazing.
kinds of, and then you start with a system, different colors. So different, blue is really important. Green is like, oh, I should ask my doctor friends about that.
Yeah. Can I show you something? Look at all these post-it notes I've got. I have the same system. My entire screen is with post-it notes with various things I need to remember when I'm talking to people.
Good system until you forget what color was meant for what.
Yeah, it's pink racism.
Hello, I'm Reena Ranger, and as part of our In Conversation series, today I'm talking to Sathnam Sanghera, author of the best-selling book Empireland. Sathnam was born to Punjabi immigrant parents in Wolverhampton in 1976. He entered the education system unable to speak English, but after attending Wolverhampton Grammar School, he graduated from Christ College, Cambridge with a first-class degree in English language and literature in 1988. He's been shortlisted for the Costa Book Awards twice for his memoir, The Boy with the Top Knot, and his novel, Marriage Material, and has also been shortlisted for or won the Desmond Elliott Prize, the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize, the Penn Artillery Prize, and Mind of the Year. He's won numerous prizes for his journalism at the Financial Times and the Times, including Young Journalist of the Year in 2002, Media Commentator of the Year in 2015, and the Edgar Wallace Trophy for writing of the highest quality at the 2017 London Press Club Awards. His third book, Empireland, How Imperialism Shaped Modern Britain, became an instant Sunday Times bestseller on release in 2021. Whilst there was Empire, there were debates at the time in Parliament, there were commentators about Empire at that time. But now when we talk about Empire, Brexit, I think you put Hoovers in there, you can't talk about them without getting into a culture war, and everything is so binary and toxic. Why do you think it's come to that?
The way we talk about empire in this country is really, really dysfunctional. We either don't think about it, so we tend to see ourselves as the nation that won World War II, rather than the country that had the greatest empire in human history. And yet the rest of the world sees us generally as the country that had the greatest empire in human history and then lost it. And then there's the other view, which is that the balance sheet idea, that you can balance the good against the positive and somehow come to a conclusion that empire was good or bad, which is just illiterate because it's 400 years of history. You know what I mean? You can't, it's not like reviewing a book on Amazon. It is very complicated. And I'm saying, actually, you can't conclude it was negative or positive. It was just really complicated. And then you've got this idea, increasingly common, empire was always good, which is absurd and just not true. And also it's a silly way of looking at history. I mean, history doesn't care about your feelings. It's not about instilling pride or even shame, because there's the opposite view, which is that empire is a great source of shame. History is just facts. It's argument. And I think we need to get the emotion out of it. And the way I've tried to write the book, which is to talk about the legacies of empire, I think is a less emotional, more sane way of looking at empire, hopefully.
I think in one of my little tabs, A.G. Hopkins gives you some really good advice. He says, what seems like a contradiction is really just a different view of the same phenomenon. So like you say, two things can be true. Empire was good, empire was bad. You can be amazed at the feat of this empire, which at its peak was almost a quarter of the world's landmass. And then you can find some of it really uncomfortable. I've had to skim parts of your book because they were just horrific in what you were telling us. So like you say, the balance sheet is impossible. There are petitions about having this taught at school level and in the national curriculum. I think one has reached 200,000, so it will be debated in Parliament at some point. So that I think there is a consensus that something needs to be taught, but what do we teach? Where would you, if you had to write the national curriculum, what would you include? Where would you start? Where would you end?
Well, yeah, I don't feel like there's going to be a political solution, to be honest, because you got people like Robert Jenrick and Oliver, was it Dowden, the culture secretary, writing weekly columns about how we need to defend British history because from the woke people who want to criticize it. Like, there's this idea that you need to be proud of British history to be proud of being British and vice versa. It's nonsensical. It's like saying, I'm proud of jelly. You know what I mean? I'm proud of biology. What do you mean? Are you proud of the bit where I came over? Are you proud of the bit where we had slavery. What do you mean? It's utterly nonsense. And so we got Dowden writing, I think, a column yesterday about this. And then Jenrick saying he wants to introduce a law to protect the statues. But on the other side, you had Jeremy Corbyn a few years ago saying we need to teach imperial history and the crimes of empire, which I think is just as dysfunctional. I don't think there's going to be a solution found in the parties. I think the solution is going to be found through teachers and through a new generation of kids who really want to know. I find that younger kids, well, anyone younger than me, they know a lot because they get their information from Instagram and from Facebook, and they have films like Black Panther, which are very, angry about colonialism. And I feel that's where it's going to happen. I mean, the national curriculum isn't actually taught everywhere now because the academies don't have to teach it and private schools don't.
Yeah.
And I've had dozens of teachers get in touch with me saying, you know what, I'm already teaching it. And I feel that the politicians can bang on about it, but change is happening anyway. So see you later.
But I think we're falling into that debate where it has to be binary and it has to be either, defend or crimes, and we shouldn't fall into that. And for better, for worse, I think you've become a bit of a teacher to a lot of, you're an Instant Times bestseller. People are reading your book. You are now become that teacher of legacy of empire, and people are learning things that they'd never heard of before. So
yeah,
I
think there's a load of books you can teach that are quite neutral. Anything by William Dalrymple, even Jan Morris, I disagree with the conclusions, but it's a great history of empire. But yeah, I guess what I wanted my book to be was to be a balanced introduction to empire, which wasn't available, frankly, or if it was available. But think about William Dalrymple's books; they're amazing, but they're focused on one part of empire. Empire was more than India, and you have a load of books about slavery, and that's just one part of empire. There was nothing that was balanced and gave you a kind of an idiot's introduction to empire. And hopefully, my book is that.
I think you're right. There's a lot of information fragmented in places. If you start Googling and looking for it, you will see empire lessons everywhere. I've even watched the Key Stage 3 Jeremy and Paxman clips, which have been very enlightening. But there's nothing.
Paxman's book on empire is actually very good.
But there's another one to read. But there's nothing that brings it all together in one place in a kind of, as you say, holistic, full, over-rounded view. And I think that's what we possibly need. And also, where would you end? I mean, if you're reading your book, you realize where the legacy of empire is in terms of British politics, the number of peerages, parliamentarians, prime ministers we've had, and then that goes off into a whole tangent of the history of Britain and all the courses it's charted.
Yeah, no, it's a big subject, 400 years of history, really, which is why it took 4 years to read about it. It's very complicated.
4 years, and people might wonder why, but your bibliography is about that much of the book.
Yeah. My editor wanted me to put less in, like fewer notes, but I'm glad people like you are looking at the notes more than the bibliography. And so it gives you an idea what you can read next.
And you can read a lot next. Do you think there's going to be a second edition where once you're allowed to leave your living room, you go to Bristol and Liverpool and London and perhaps beyond and have a different kind of view with primary sources? I mean, of course, people who are no longer here who you would probably want to speak to, but talking to them about the legacy in those areas and around the world.
I'm a very slow writer, so it takes me at least 5 to 8 years to write a book. But I mean, my publishers were talking about bringing out a kids edition. I think we talked about it, but actually, I don't think we need one because there, like you said, there's quite a lot of violence in the book, a bit of rape, a lot of looting, and I think young children might struggle, shouldn't really be exposed to that. But I think most GCSE students and A-level students could read it. And actually, I don't want to dumb it down. I just think it's something kids can discover for themselves when they get a bit older. And so I don't want to do a kids edition. But I am doing a documentary. I'm doing a 2-part documentary for Channel 4 about it, where I might do what you suggested.
I think it is hard to read in places. You say that, the story of empire is a story of individual people. And there are some really heartening stories. I like Lady Mew. If we'd been taught it, I could pronounce it, but I can't. Mew. Yeah. And what she did for the people of Ethiopia. I don't know if you want to elaborate. And also, you can't talk about the people without talking about Dean Mohammed, who, for me, this huge, larger-than-life character, this entrepreneur. I think you can only define him as a character. I felt he was the original Indian uncle in some of his just ways. Would you like to talk about any of the characters that have touched you?
Yeah, both of those characters make two very important points. Lady Mu was an aristocrat, very rich lady who bought a bunch of treasures looted from Ethiopia, I think in the 1868, excursion into Ethiopia. The Brits basically invaded Ethiopia as a punitive expedition to rescue some British hostages, basically. And in the process, they looted a load of incredibly valuable stuff from Ethiopia, which is now on display in all our museums. But Lady Mu, I think in the early 20th century, was approached by an Ethiopian cleric who saw some of the Bibles she had from Ethiopia and broke into tears. And she gave it back to him and said, "Oh my God, I can't believe we've been stealing this stuff," which is a weird thing to say given she'd bought it. But what that point demonstrates is that even at the time, even during Empire, there were people who thought some of this stuff was excessive. And now, if I say we should return some of the things, some of the Ethiopian artifacts that the V&A has, I would be called woke. But actually, Lady Mu objected to it. And William Gladstone himself, he said, famously said, "I hope we can return the items to Ethiopia because the circumstances in which they are taken were morally obscene." You know what I mean? So if I'm woke, so is William Gladstone, so is Lady Mu, so is actually Winston Churchill, who said the Jallianwala Bagh massacre was a monstrous. And I think we forget that. We forget that Empire was opposed all the way through. And the thing about Dean Mohammed is that he was basically an Indian man living in London in the early 1800s, which was a remarkable fact for me because I thought it was mass immigration in the 20th century that brought people of color here. And I think a lot of our communities kind of repeat that narrative. And it's not true because actually they were here for centuries earlier. I mean, Queen Elizabeth I was complaining about there being too many black people in 1600, you know. First Bengali was born in 1616 in London, you know. And Dean Mohammed, you know, introduced the first curry house in London and then became a famous Indian shampooist, which is kind of a massage guy. He became I think the king became one of his customers in Brighton. And he also became the first Indian to write a book in English, although it was a terrible book. But the point is, he was here and a national figure hundreds of years ago, and we should remember that.
He made me laugh. You know, he's adjusting his biography, chopping bits out, doing whatever he needed to make it all work for him. I also think, you know, we spoke about what suitable age this is reading. You have characters like Thistlewood who I don't think are suitable reading for kids, but I think are really important lessons in terms of what happens when you lose your compassion, humanity, when you see people not as people anymore.
Yeah, the amazing thing about him was, I mean, he was a slave owner, a slave driver in Jamaica. And I mean, he raped, murdered, tortured hundreds of his slaves. But he saw himself as an incredibly enlightened man and spent his spare time reading these enlightenment books and exchanged really intellectual letters with his friends in Britain and saw himself as a Christian. Incredible.
I think you can't always ask your parents sometimes because they are part of the legacy of Empire through migration or partition or whatever happened. Do you think it's because we're becoming an age?
Yeah, I think our parents in general didn't talk about things, partly because it was so painful, but also because they were working so hard to establish themselves and didn't want to focus on the negative. I think it's happening because of Black Lives Matter. That's created a real interest in, you know, the causes of systemic racism. I mean, does Empire cause, you know, is that the reason for our modern racism, which I argue in the book that it is? It's one of the reasons. And I feel like it's the younger people, I mean, who are very animated by it. And also it's being propelled by the backlash, because there's a huge backlash with all these politicians saying we need to protect history and protect our statues. And that in itself makes young people even more animated, you know. But having said that, there are loads of people of my generation and above who read the book. And I mean, it's not like they're resisting it. They've never been taught it either. And they're amazed. So I think there's just a general movement that wants to know more and is really animated by this history.
I think that's fair enough. I think people are they're definitely more and more interested and trying to make sense of who they are, how they got here, and a lot of stuff. I think I see a lot of parallels with your book and some of the conversations about that we have today. Firstly, the news has made a lot more sense as well. Just some of the stuff, geopolitics, you kind of go, oh, that's why. But whether you talk about immigration, sovereignty, governance, tax money going from one place to another, you can see, the most obvious one is Brexit and some of the debates and discussions we've had. I think, just to read a bit from your book, you say that in the early 17th century, the British Isles population was less than 7 million. 350 years later, 140 million of their descendants were living overseas. 9.7 million migrated from Britain between 1853 and 1920. And South Africa was referred to as Greater Cornwall, as a quarter of all the white mining workforce were Cornish. And then you talk about integration, about people who were finding it hard after they'd worked in empire or served in different places, coming back home. You talk about Britain absorbing migrants 1,000 times over history. I'm telling you stuff you know, but just in case others don't, you talk about all the waves of different immigration we've had. Do you think topics like immigration, which are very divisive, can be very toxic, if we had some of that education behind us, do you think some of the debates would be different on both sides, not just on but pro against both?
Yeah, it would transfer. I'm glad you mentioned that thing about British people traveling a lot, because the legacies are, you can weigh up as being positive and negative, because these are things we live with. And one of the more positive legacies of imperialism we have is the way we travel the world. I mean, we kind of emigrate like no other nation on earth. I think we're the world's fourth most enthusiastic tourists, and wherever you go, you'll find British people, and that's a positive thing. And the other thing, multiculturalism, I think, is a positive thing. The reason we're a multicultural society is because we had a multicultural empire. And in the debate about multiculturalism, it's always the case of, the immigrants need to learn English, they need to integrate, which is true. But at the time, I think the host community needs to remember that we came here for a reason. In the case of the Sikhs, we came here because we'd fought in both world wars in huge numbers. We took the side of the British in the mutiny of 1857. The British story of British Empire is also our story. And if it was acknowledged by Britain that we are here for reasons that go back centuries, that essentially some of us arrived here as citizens, the people on the Windrush didn't come here for jobs. They had no jobs lined up. They came here because the 1948 Nationality Act gave them citizenship, which is a really important point, because those people are now being deported, some of them. And that is why it's so unjust. How can you deport citizens? But that's the level of poor understanding about empire that can happen.
I think education is key. And you've spoken about Empire Day, as when you open the book, you talk about Empire Day and what it used to be. I think it's a really great idea. I think when you are made aware that 99% of the stuff that museums have is in storage, that the National History Museum can only display 5% of its stuff at one time, there is this whole wealth that is stored away that just needs to be seen or heard or whatever it is. So for me, Empire Day is this massive kind of, I don't want to take statues down. I think they should be left up, and you should have an interactive kind of website where you click on the statues and it gives you a Sathnam kind of bibliography to go and explore more. You've got coordinated tours in Scotland, Liverpool, Bristol, London at the same time, packed lunch of your choice, some kind of interactive app that you scan around and things pop up. What is Empire Day for you?
Yeah, Empire Day is something that actually happened, as I explained in the introduction. It was set up by Lord Meath in the early 20th century, and it was a way to celebrate what empire had done for Britain. So kids had a half a day off school, and it went on until the 50s and 60s, It actually still exists in that it became Commonwealth Day, which is still celebrated. But I'm with you in the statues, although you've got to contextualize them, and it's all about education. But I also think it doesn't matter. They're just statues. And if they're torn down, who cares? It's not like, it's much more significant that our racism is explained by empire, that our wealth, a lot of our wealth comes from empire. That's more important. The obsession with statues is kind of irrelevant to me. But I like the idea, an author called Robert Winder said recently that what we should do is, like in Spain, they have this annual day where they throw tomatoes at things, right? We should have an annual day where we're allowed to throw tomatoes at the statues we hate. and that's fine. No one's going to get hurt, right? You can turn the tomatoes into compost. And I personally would really like to, throw tomatoes at Lord Clive in Whitehall. And I think about that statue a lot, because Rishi Sunak has to look at that statue every day of his life. And that statue is of a man who hated Indians. He said that every day spent in India was a misery. He stole the equivalent of 700 million pounds from India, killed himself, and was wildly controversial in his lifetime. When the statue was put up, the Viceroy of India said it was needlessly provocative. And yet now, anyone who says, oh, that maybe that statue should come down is seen as woke. But, if I'm woke, again, the Viceroy of India was probably woke. But so I'm all up for kind of just insulting these statues once a year.
I like my interactive statue. Click it, lots of stuff comes up. And like I said, there are characters that you may not agree with, but they are still lessons of some sort for our future. You need to have that horror of Thistlewood to understand what you never want to go back to, or type of person you want to be. And in my Empire Day on my website, you can nominate and bid and vote for your new statue of choice. And I think as long as you know what they are, as long as they are described and, like you say, contextualized, there is a rich history to learn from.
Yeah, but there's this idea that if you take down a statue, you're taking down history. Statues aren't history. History is argument, and statues aren't about argument. They're about celebrating people. And history changes, and so it's perfectly okay to, by democratic means, to take down statues, to change names. They changed a street name in Southall from the guy who was involved in the mutiny to Guru Nanak Road, I think. And I think that's a great thing. I mean, finally, we are meant to be one of the most successful immigrant communities in Britain. Why can't we have one road in Britain named after us? There's a massive temple there where every politician in Britain goes every election time. If they can do that, why can't they just change one road name? So I'm all for changing things if necessary. It's not erasing history.
For me, I don't think I can ever drink tea again. Tea, as a British Indian is there at every kind of large moment you think about: births, deaths, marriages, Myroka, awkward conversations. And then you kind of now get a cup of tea and you understand this, you have this existential moment where you understand how we got tea.
Yeah, and one of the crazy things is Rishi Sunak recently went viral because he was talking about drinking Yorkshire tea. Yorkshire tea has always pissed me off because it's not grown in Yorkshire, is it? But the story of tea is fascinating because it was actually a Chinese commodity, which the British then stole and started planting in India, and then obviously became this thing that drove a whole economy. Incredible.
It's mental, right? And I don't know if you've had all these moments where you're doing something, you realize, my gosh, when I retired to my bungalow, another existential moment, when you put your pajamas on at night, all these kind of things that we didn't know, that you had this, just one commodity has a massive history. People died for tea, wars.
Yeah, sugar. I mean, there's slaves who died for sugar. It's incredible, right?
There are these things.
And that's why there was a boycott of sugar when abolition was happening, when the campaign for abolition. Some people stopped taking sugar in their tea in protest.
But they had the tea, which also is a problem.
Yeah, well, it doesn't necessarily need to be a problem. It's just important to understand it, isn't it?
I think that otherwise it would have just been warm water, and that would have been, less of a condiment there, less of a drink that changes. Thank you very much for your time.
Always, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
No, it's a great book, and I look forward to the rest of the stuff that comes out. You're becoming famous in our house. I'm teaching the kids. I'm trying to teach my kids Hindi and Punjabi or something that resembles one or the other, or a mixture of two. And then I tell them about this nice man that went to India who wanted a cool drink and got hit over the head with a stick because. So we thank you for that education too.
No worries. Well, good luck in lockdown, and see you in real life soon, hopefully.
Look forward to it. See you. Bye.
Bye.